Hello, everybody. This is Brian from Necronomicast. Thank you for tuning in for this exciting 13th season of the show. Couldn't do it without you. Now, if you're ever wondering if there was a kind of a fun and inexpensive way that you could support the production of the show, I've got news for you. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/Necronomicast. Every time I have an author on the show, I've purchased their book. Whenever a documentary filmmaker or a creative person is on the show to talk about their project, you know I've supported their project. So if you go to buymeacoffee.com/Necronomicast, that will enable me to continue to do the work that I do here on the show. So I thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart for all of the support and encouragement you've given me over the years. And you know what? If you buy me a cup of coffee at the website, I would be more than happy to deliver a personalized message to you on the show. 2 or more cups of coffee, you're going to get something in the mail. buymeacoffee.com/Necronomicast. And now, on with the show. From the historic, haunted heartland of Omaha, Nebraska, my name is Brian Corey, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all, young and old, to this special episode of the world-famous Necronomicast. My guest tonight for a late-night conversation is Dr. Jeff Meldrum. He's an associate professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University and is an affiliate curator of the Idaho Museum of Natural History. He is known the world over for his scientific as well as sensible study of the Sasquatch, and his involvement in Sasquatch research began after examining fresh tracks in southeastern Washington's Blue Mountains in 1996. And ever since then, he's become one of the most respected minds in the world of Sasquatch research. Ladies and gentlemen, Sasquatch, legend meets science. And now, calling in on the Necronomicast Newsmaker Hotline, I am so excited to be joined by one of the leading researchers in Sasquatch phenomena, the great Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Doctor, thank you for taking the time to be on the show.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
I'm very excited. Sorry to jump in on top of you there.
No. I
have been such a fan of your work ever since I'm kind of like, a citizen scientist, citizen researcher. I'm interested in all these strange mysteries of the unknown, including Sasquatch, ghosts, paranormal activity, all that kind of stuff. And I've had people on the show talk about, different relationships of Sasquatch to the paranormal, not just being outside of normal, but
Sure.
but to have you on the show to kind of balance it with some of the scientific perspective is very exciting to me. So welcome once again.
Great.
Now, I'm a host and MC of the Nebraska Bigfoot Conference, which is coming up in a few weeks here in Nebraska. So when those events happen and I'm kind of moderating discussions or introducing lecturers and talking to different people that have had experiences, it runs the gamut. All kinds of scientific people that want to talk about, footprints. They want to talk about DNA. They want to talk about hair and scat, things like that. And then also people want to talk about the UFO community and if Bigfoot is dropped off. But so with your perspective and its centers, I've read your book. I love your book, Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science, right here. And so much of your work deals with your discipline in science, talking about like breaking down the footprints, especially. You have over 300 casts of footprints. So can you kind of give us an idea, my listeners that might not be familiar with your work, your background, and also like talking about the scientific, the breakdown of the footprint exactly?
Right. Well, my background, I am an anatomist / physical anthropologist. So my degree, my doctoral training was in anatomical sciences, which, the first 2 years of college were essentially medical school. I was elbow to elbow with, a medical class of some 160 students. And then as our curriculum progressed, as they started taking more clinically oriented classes, beyond the basic sciences, then I would take classes in primate evolution, primate comparative anatomy, ecology, and so on, primate behavior. And so very interested in the hominin fossil record as well. So paleontology and functional morphology and the interpretation, inferences that can be made from our skeletal remains. And particularly, I was interested in the evolution of bipedalism, how it is that we came to be adapted to walk on two legs, which is a reasonably unusual solution to the problem of getting around. Only a few other lineages have adopted that. The birds, because they've tied the forelimbs up as wings, and a few other kind of jumping animals like kangaroos, but they do it in a very different way. And as soon as they stop, they usually adopt a tripedal posture. So walking on 2 feet is an unusual balancing act for a primate. And, there's some that can do it and do it rather adeptly. So we were kind of predisposed. But in any case, my focus really was zeroed in on those evidences of the timing, the pattern, and the process by which these adaptations emerged in the fossil record. So when, in the back of my mind, having grown up in the Pacific Northwest, having seen the Patterson-Gimlin film at one of its earliest showings in Spokane, that story of Bigfoot was rattling around there, and I had been quite immersed in it as a young person. I was the type who, when I got involved with a hobby, I really went after it. But that interest had waxed and waned, and it was rather latent by the time I pursued a professional career. But it was rather abruptly brought to the fore when I had the opportunity first to evaluate a very interesting piece of video footage, which was equivocal, remains equivocal. But then on the heels of that, more important, where it really started was in early 1996, when I had the chance to actually witness a long line of 15-inch tracks in the ground, to actually see it, not just one spurious, anomalous looking footprint, but a long trackway, 35, 45, absolutely clear, and perhaps even more if we had tracked further, clear footprints in the mud of that spring thaw there in the Blue Mountains outside of Walla Walla, Washington. And anyway, to make a long story short, and many of your listeners may have already heard this recounting, but that really set the hook. I mean, because I was very immersed in the study of hominin and human footprints, modern human footprints, as well as all of the comparative material of great apes and other plantigrade animals such as bear and so forth that might bear on the question of interpreting footprint evidence and inferring from that functional morphology and adaptation and even taxonomic questions of relationships and origins. And so here I am looking at these 15-inch footprints and, literally kind of pinching myself. Is this real? Is this a hoax? They were so clear and so fresh. They had to have been laid down in the wee hours of the previous night or early morning. It was kind of a wet, drizzly, overcast weather that day, and there was even standing water in some of the footprints. But you could kneel down. They were so fresh, you could kneel down and actually see the skin ridge detail, the dermatoglyphics, preserved in this very fine substrate of the tilled soil of this farm access road. We were right in the foothills, just outside of the national forest, and there was no equivocation, no in between, no gray zone. They were either hoaxed or they were the real deal. And, I know footprints, and not that there's a lot of people out there hoaxing fossil hominin footprints, but the interpretation of less than perfect footprints, you become very attuned to the interpretation of often subtle details, and these had all the hallmarks of very spontaneous, very legitimate, credible footprints. And so now here we are, 25 years later, more plus 28 years, and I have over 300 footprint casts in the lab, not only of Sasquatch here from North America, but other examples of potential relic hominoids, other potential species. Early on, I was always kind of shy about even broaching the topic of the Yeti or the Russian Almas or the Yowie, because going out on the limb for one to investigate one was bad enough, but to suggest there were more. But see, now from the perspective of revelations in science of late, the existence of these other forms, not equivalent to Bigfoot. These are not just Bigfoot in Russia, Bigfoot in Australia. They're different lineages, different species of hominoid. Their existence actually reinforces the credibility, because we now see the evolutionary history of the hominoids broadly and the hominins specifically. Hominoids would be all the man-like primates, so the great apes, even the gibbons, all the tailless primates, as well as all of our ancestors and cousins on our family tree since splitting from the common ancestor shared with the other apes, namely chimpanzees. So all across this, now it's bushy. It's a bushy tree. It's not a single file march, one species giving rise to another, being supplanted by another, and so forth. Because then, the attitude was we were the last representative of that single file, and so there was no place, no hook to hang the notion of another population of bipedal hominids. But now, with this bushy tree and with evidence of some of these branches persisting alongside ours until remarkably recently, as acknowledged in science today, it's just a snap of the fingers, a wink of the eye. 20 to 30,000 years ago, there were multiple. There were as many as 6 or 7 different species on the landscape. Why would it be different now? The fact that we have these very rare and remotely located species, or generally remote can be a relative term depending on your frame of reference, but I mean, Nebraska's not that remote.
Right.
And there's actually some questions about some of the allegations, some of the reporting from areas like Nebraska and Kansas and Iowa and Indiana and so forth, the Midwest. But nevertheless, I mean, the point being, the existence of these other lineages now makes sense. I mean, in Russia, the Almas, those reports are coming specifically from areas that were once occupied, as evidenced by the archaeological record and the paleontological, the skeletal remains of fossil Neanderthals. Mm-hmm. And so, and many aspects of the descriptions of the Almasti, as they differ and are distinct from the Bigfoot, portray, one idea of what a Neanderthal might be like. The little orang pendek or the Endutu, the Ibu Gogo of Southeast Asia, the little people, remnant Australopithecines, early Homo habilis, that were diminutive, that were 3.5 feet tall, maybe, in some of their iterations. And so, I mean, it's just remarkable the way they fall into place and alignment, and could very easily represent remnant populations of this once very bushy tree that now are just the trailing tendrils of branches that were parallel to us for millennia.
Now, I totally admire your intellect and your research and all the time that you put into this book. Especially, you wrote it in a way, it's a textbook, scientific. It's like everything that I wanted to arm myself when people say, well, that's a guy in a monkey suit. these are people that are just putting wooden forms on their feet and walking for so it's like it gives me enough ammunition to fire back at some of the naysayers. But what I love about your book as well, and it's super important, and you stress this, and I can't highlight this enough, is you take like this contemporary scientific evidence and all your research of the reality of this legendary species, and of course these species all over the world that have been reported, but you also take equal time to explore the history of tribal peoples and their traditional knowledge of these creatures, which I think is super important, because you don't just say, well, these are just folklore, these are only mythology. Like, these are important stories that have been handed down for centuries, and you incorporate it with, like you said, this bushy kind of family tree of how it forks out across the entire planet.
Right. Exactly. And it was very fortunate. The editors, the publisher was very prescient in that regard, because in the actual documentary, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, that chapter was not represented. Mm-hmm. But they pointed out that there was that glaring absence. And I agreed wholeheartedly and was able to cull together some great information. It's kind of challenging to do a synthesis, because the individual tribes don't even talk amongst themselves really about this phenomenon very much. And so to do a cross-cultural synthesis is a challenge. And so I was very fortunate that Gail Hypine had a very good treatment. She, being tribal, could access some of those contacts and informants and so on, and elders, and get some of that material together. And she was gracious enough to let me reprint her essay in full, since it hadn't really been published anywhere formally. And so that's a great synopsis. But yeah, I mean, it's such a apropos response to those who say, well, Bigfoot started in 1958 when supposedly, the Wallaces were tromping around with these carved wooden stompers, these crude devices to make footprints all over the United States. And well, then how do you explain? There recently, in fact, the timing is such that there was recently a little blurb that was put out on someone's blog about that the native traditions have been co-opted by modern enthusiasts, and that their early traditions don't really describe anything that can be equated with the modern concept of Sasquatch. And he couldn't be further from the truth. And so as editor of the Relic Hominoid Inquirer, another publication that I hope your readers take advantage of, I edit a scholarly journal with the assistance of an editorial board that is comprised of PhDs and professionals of various disciplines that are appropriate to this topic. But one of the pieces I'm working on editing right now is we solicited reactions and commentary to his sort of very superficial, very condescending attitude about the Native American perspective on the existence of a giant subhuman hominoid of some sort. Mm-hmm. And so we've gotten reactions from cultural anthropologists, and the Native American voice, once again, is added by those who are willing to offer their reaction to this kind of silly assertion that he's put forward.
Yeah, and you defend yourself, and you defend these stories quite well throughout your book. And like my wife's a physical therapist, so I was reading to her I have a musician background, so like this was a lot of it was not, I don't want to say over my head, but I had to like really carefully read it. But I was reading a lot of things to her, and she's like, "Oh wow, that makes sense." When you're talking about the breakdown of the foot and and all these things, and like all these footprints and all this evidence, it's like these hoaxes, I mean, not hoaxes, but like so many of them, like you point out in your book that like really hoaxes and these footprints, they're so rare. And a lot of people think they see these footprints, and it's mostly misidentification. But there are these circumstances. There are these times, like you said, you saw these fresh tracks, and you're just like, it rocks your world. You're actually seeing some kind of amazing evidence. And we're about 56 years, we're like 20 years, almost 20 years since you wrote your book. I don't know if you updated it. I have just this version here. And about 56 some odd years since Patterson-Gimlin. And like your book should be like a gold standard in terms of defending a scientific approach to these subjects. And the Patterson-Gimlin film, which you, I don't want to say defend, but you explain and show a lot of ways how it absolutely could be some kind of, important, the gold standard of like, I guess, visual evidence.
Right. So it definitely is.
Yeah. 56 years later, we're still talking about, and I've had Bob Gimlin on the show. It was like a highlight of my podcasting career. I told Bob if I never talked to anybody ever again, I was so excited to have Bob Gimlin on my show.
Yeah.
But just like the importance, now we're almost 60 years away with the importance of the Patterson-Gimlin film. It's still just as relevant now as it was back when it was recorded back in those days.
Yeah. It's the Energizer Bunny. It just keeps going and going. And in fact, what's interesting is as the time passes, our perspective is modified in some ways and lends even more credibility. When I speak about the Patterson-Gimlin film, with a 50 plus years retrospective hindsight, the advantage of hindsight, the way I approach it is, okay, here's what was presented in 1967, and yet, and here's some of the reasons that anthropology rejected it, because it presented something that seemed to be counterintuitive to the conventional wisdom in anthropology about hominin evolution at that time. For example, and then this were individual characteristics, but even more impressive sometimes are unexpected combinations of traits which had no precedent in 1967 in the hominin fossil record or understanding of human evolution. One of my favorite that illustrates this, Dr. John Napier, was a primatologist at the Smithsonian. He was actually on the panel that viewed the film and commented on it to the press, the first U.S. scientific viewing of the film. They had done it up in British Columbia with a cadre of Canadian anthropologists up there, and got similar responses because it was being considered against this backdrop of anthropology a la 1967. Well, when Napier came out kind of thumbs down, he was a little more open-minded about the topic, so much so, and apparently impressed by the general evidence for the subject matter, that he, in his golden years after retirement or at retirement, he wrote a book, the first real scientific treatment. I mean, there had been Ivan Sanderson's book, which was the encyclopedic treatment. Ivan never had the ultimate credentials, that doctorate behind his name, but he had a lot of accolades and a reputation as a field naturalist that was very respected. But Napier's was the first treatment of the topic of Sasquatch and Yeti by a bona fide anthropologist well, he was actually, much like me, an anatomist. He was actually a physician who became an anthropologist. So, which brought interesting perspectives, including his assessment of the footprint evidence. But when it came to the film, he looked at it and he said, although I reject it, I can't really defend that rejection, except one thing just sticks out. And that is, when I look at that figure, I see something which from the waist up essentially looks like an ape, but from the waist down has legs and hips like a human. And he said it was virtually inconceivable that such a hybrid of structure would exist in nature, such an unusual combination, a mosaic. So he said, therefore, it must be contrived. And so it was fake. Right. Well, it was interesting because his book came out in 1972, I think it was. Later in that decade, in the later 70s, we had this kind of golden age of discoveries in Africa of Australopithecines. This was when Lucy had her debut.
I was going to bring her up. Yeah.
Yeah. And for the first time, we had more complete skeletons that allowed the consideration of everything from the head to the toes. And when they described, this unusual combination of traits to the press, they said it's interesting because from the waist up, she looks like a chimpanzee, but from the waist down, she looks like a little human. Well, wait a minute. That was
Right.
that was the linchpin of the argument that formed the basis of Napier's rejection of the Patterson-Gimlin film, was that combination that they, and a lot of the silly comments. Well, I can't help but wonder, what if Napier had lived long enough or had postponed the writing of his book by a decade, what would his reaction have been in light of those discoveries? And so that's kind of the approach that I take. Is I show this whole laundry list of characteristics or combination of characteristics, which when considered in 1967, and even up until sometimes, just a few decades ago, were absolutely against the grain. They were counter to the conventional wisdom in anthropology at the time. And yet now it is exactly in line with recent discoveries and current conventional wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess we should always learn the lessons of the past and not place too much stock in what we consider to be now conventional wisdom. There may be additional discoveries, but what's amazing is so many of the things that prompted the negativity and the rejection of the film by so-called experts of the time turned out to were borne out by subsequent discoveries. It actually anticipated that knowledge by sometimes decades, if not half century. Give Roger the luck of the draw that he got one thing right, but to have a whole list
right
of interrelated things that just fell right in line. I mean, if he was being coached by someone in the wings on how to fake a creature to try to get scientific acceptance, why would anybody worth their salt in anthropology advise him along those lines? Plant the ideas of the very things that would be rejected, and somehow yet have the knowledge of things to come. So it's a fascinating way to consider the film. Like I say, it just keeps on going.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like and the advancements that we're making in technology and being able to, I don't know where the first generation, like the original is. I don't even know if it's
lost.
It's lost. Okay.
It's
we
lost,
have like whatever the cleanest copy is. But right. I see like you can just go to YouTube now and find 4K resolution, slowed down, enhanced. And I'm not worried, but I just like someday I hope these are preserved in some way, because somebody or AI is going to throw in, something in the background, or, make a spaceship fly down. I mean, like, I'm always worried about this. So I'm kind of a purist in that regard. I do appreciate the cleansing of the film, or the enhancements and being able to stabilize. I appreciate all that. But that was the best technology of the time. And I'm just, I had a conversation with Dr. Maria Mayer on my show. We had a little connection because I'm in Omaha, and she studied some in Omaha when she was working on her PhD at the Omaha Zoo. Have you been in the Omaha Zoo?
I've not. No.
Best in the country. Anyway, but like what she was talking about, like these advancements in eDNA, and so like seeing if there's any kind of like relationship of eDNA, like maybe a scant relation of chimpanzee DNA or anything like that might be that, and like drone footage and heat seeking technology. Like, do you see how like what's the next generation of like Bigfoot hunting rather than just going out and whistling in the woods?
Yeah, well, that encompasses what I have been for the last 10 years now have been suggesting are the two directions that will take us a step up from the trail cameras and the night vision and the thermal binoculars and so on. And that is, as drone technology, and we tried, a little overly ambitious project was proposed that became quite controversial, quite a lightning rod for skeptics and enthusiasts alike. But of using lighter than air ships because the drone multicopter class of drone has a very limited airtime, and because it's battery powered.
Sure. Okay.
And even that limited battery time is further restricted by, safety margins for deployment and retrieval. You don't want the battery to go dead when it's 180 feet up in the air and have your expensive drone and camera, usually which is more expensive than the drone itself, come crashing to the ground. So those there have been problems. I mean, or not problems. There have been limitations to the technology and its application. I've seen some great examples. There was one that that always comes to mind. There was an episode of, and now see, I'm kind of shooting from the hip. A Living or Extinct, I think, was the TV series. The investigator is the grandson of one of the scientists involved in the discovery of the coelacanth, and he's a zoologist of his own right and accomplishments, but he goes after these reports of animals that are rare and elusive and or thought to have been extinct. And one, they were looking for these white wolves up in Canada, and it was just the perfect scenario that I would love to have happen with Sasquatch. And it was the perfect illustration of how these drones can be so useful. And that is, he had a station, a lure, not bait, but a lure that they were playing wounded rabbit sounds or something, I think. And then it had this little thing that would flick a tuft of rabbit hair on the end of it, almost like a car aerial.
Yeah.
What used to be car aerials, you don't have car aerials anymore. But,
I know what you're talking about.
yeah, just a flexible wire. Anyway, and then he's down in his hide, all bundled up because it's overcast and rainy and cold, and all of a sudden he sees a flash of fur, and is pretty confident of what he saw. And they actually had one camera that caught it just dart and across a gap in the forest in the tree line, races back to where the crew is bivouacked some distance back, just tens of yards out of the way, and said, "Get the drone in the air, get the drone in the air." And they deploy this drone with a thermal camera and capture these beautiful images of these two wolves running in between the trees, making their way, off. And I thought, oh, if we could just do that with Sasquatch. But it exhibited how useful a drone can be in that situation. A pop-up aerial view, a bird's eye view to reconnoiter what is happening.
Yeah.
As far as systematic survey, I mean, if he were to go out at night, put up his camera and just hope that they would run into a wolf, the chances are really, really, really small. Anyway, that's one.
Okay.
So the technologies are improving, the air times are improving, lighter weight cameras, and so forth, so forth. Two, you mentioned, was eDNA.
Right.
And that's, what that does is allow you to cast the net more broadly instead of having to have a Sasquatch actually touch something or find the scat of a Sasquatch. You're sampling the environment for traces of DNA that have been shed by all the forest creatures that are then accumulated in the soil or in water or even in the air under certain conditions, certain circumstances. But it's not a silver bullet. It's the unfortunate thing. It's like, people always saying, well, why don't you do this? Well, why haven't you thought of this? Well, actually, I have thought of it. Actually, we have tried these things, but you got to stop and think about it for a minute. And if we're comparing two organisms that are remarkably similar to one another, I mean, if we were comparing us to chimps, and we were using very degraded DNA from the field and so forth, we resemble chimps at about 90, depending on which part of the genome you're looking at, anywhere from 94 to 98% identity. I mean, we are 98% chimpanzee. That is, we share exactly with chimps and vice versa, 90 up to 98% of our DNA. It's the differences are in those two percentages.
Well, I was going to ask you, what are the, excuse me I'm sorry, but what are the odds of having false negatives with like that?
Well, exactly.
There's
This
a
is
small like a narrow piece of DNA is analyzed. I mean, so
right.
yeah.
So if Sasquatch is not, say, Gigantopithecus, is not closely related to our closest relative amongst the great apes, but maybe it is a hominin. Maybe it's something like a gigantic Paranthropus descendant. Or in other words, it's on the other side of the split. And we're kind of splitting hairs, to pardon the pun, but because it would have to be a very early offshoot, one that preceded an offshoot that preceded the emergence of Homo, because it shows none of the enlargement of the brain, none of the material culture, none of the accomplishments that set Homo apart from the predecessors, from the Australopithecine grade of human evolution. So, but if that were the case, it's more closely related to us than a chimp, which means we're talking about maybe less than 2% difference, maybe 1%, maybe 0.5%, maybe 0.1% is all that separates us from Sasquatch. Well, then when you're comparing, you raise this specter of false negatives. When you're comparing two so closely related, unless you have a very complete genome that you can find that 0.5% difference, everything else you compare will be identical, virtually identical. And given the scrappy nature of degraded DNA from the environment, it's not like, you're drawing blood and you're readily getting whole genomic DNA. You're getting bits and pieces that you're having to put together. So it's not, is it surprising that when we have successfully gotten DNA from hair, more often than not, the result has been, if there is a result, it's been, well, it's human. Because usually they'll only look at, a very small fragment of a gene in the mitochondria that is, that may not include those distinctive markers that separate them from us.
Amazing.
And so the result will be, well, you've got what you have is identical to humans. Ergo, it must be human. So it was either contaminated through mishandling. If it were a legitimate Sasquatch hair, in other words, if you put it under the microscope and it looks like a Sasquatch hair, and there are distinctions, then what we think is a Sasquatch hair, let's put it that way. Right. What we've come to conclude based on repetition and reinforcement of independent samples that all seem to align and cannot be otherwise attributed readily to human or non-human species in the forest. If it looks like a Sasquatch, but yet it yields human results, then it's either been concluded that it is contaminated through mishandling by the witness, or it's just a misidentified human hair. That's a possibility because there are similarities, and I don't always get, or someone doesn't always take the time to actually look at the hair in question under a microscope. But there's a third possibility. You haven't sequenced enough to draw a definitive conclusion.
Okay.
And you result in a false negative. It's not Sasquatch because it has nothing distinct from human sequence. Well, surprise, surprise. That's going to be the result in the vast majority of times if you are looking at a scant portion of the DNA sequence.
Amazing. So we've talked about eDNA, we've talked about the Patterson-Gimlin, photographic kind of evidence, drone footage, and all this. Now, I love hearing people's stories, like when I'm host of this Nebraska Bigfoot conference, and people will come up and they want to tell how Sasquatch crossed the road. They want to talk about footprints. They want to talk about all kinds of things. Do you put much weight into teepee, tree structure? I heard an interview with you. I think you mentioned something one time, like you found like something that intrigued you, like a nest that had like almost what appeared to be, could be something like a bassinet even constructed.
Right.
I get those stories a lot too. Like they'll talk about, teepees, tree structures, things like that. And they seem like, and sometimes nature is amazing how things fall down.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
I don't want to say every tree that's fallen down in the wilderness is because a Sasquatch was using it as a scratching post, But
That's right.
but
No, and this kind of goes back to the old, often used and sometimes abused principle of Occam's razor. The abuse is Occam never said that the simplest is more likely to be true. Rather, as a philosopher of science who emphasized research by falsification, that is, acknowledging you cannot examine every instance. So it makes more logical sense to look for an exception rather than try to prove every possible outcome. And so once you have an exception, once you falsify your hypothesis, then you're justified to go back to the drawing board and elaborate in order to accommodate the exception, the contradiction, in order to explain that. You're not justified in starting with the most complex and convoluted explanation. So when it comes to a tree structure, if the alternatives are it's a blowdown that got caught in a fork, which caught the next, and so forth, versus a Sasquatch creating this enigmatic, inexplicable structure that serves no logical purpose, then you're obliged, until you can falsify that first option, the simpler option, to stick with it.
Right.
But now, see, if you have more data, that there in the center of this teepee, there's a scat pile and a pair of footprints on either side of it, then that would be important evidence. I always say, or hair entangled in the bark of one of the poles, one of the beams, and you can put it on a microscope and it fits the gold standard of what we think Sasquatch hair looks like. So to illustrate this, one time we were doing a documentary. I can't remember now where it was. I think it was on Vancouver Island, but they wanted to feature structures. And the local contact, she knew of a place where there were some that had been attributed to Sasquatch. Well, and the setting was not compelling. It was this little strip of undeveloped land. I mean, it was less than a quarter mile across between two subdivisions. And
okay. All right.
there were these lodgepole pines, these very, great, teepee pole narrow trees. And there was a lot of blowdown all over the floor. And there were a few of these teepee structures. And I said, look, we came in here with a sheet of graph paper and a compass and a pen, and you took a bearing. You started mapping on your graph paper every downed tree trunk, including those in the teepees, and indicate them at the proper orientation. I guarantee you then, if you looked at the result, you would not be able to differentiate the teepees, because those elements of the teepee would, if just projected on a two-dimensional plane, would look exactly like all of the other blowdown, the random pattern of blowdown. It's just that one got snagged and which caught another and caught another, kept it from going down to the ground.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that wasn't sensational enough for them. So they didn't include that element of my interview in the documentary. But now, on a totally different page, you have this nest possibility, and the Olympic project identified. Well, it was initially identified by a timber cruiser for the timber company there that owned this property. It was gated land. The location was pretty arduous to get to, and so behind a lock gate. You went down several miles down the road. From that, you had to go off road about 2 or 3 miles up and down. And here was on the edge of this embankment, very steep embankment, a couple 100 feet tall, hedged in by these 7-foot tall evergreen blueberries, were these clusters of nests that, for all intents and purposes, looked like birds' nests, or looked like ground nests that gorillas make. In fact, some interesting comparisons. They weren't just hummocks of detritus and leaf litter piled up, which bears do, for example. They just scrape. They don't have opposable thumbs, so they just scrape the leaf litter up. They're essentially attempting to make a layer of insulation to sleep on,
Sure.
so they don't lose body heat to the ground, which is a challenge we all face when you sleep out in the woods. These, however, were constructed. They were complicated. One of the things they did when I was finally afforded the opportunity to go out and explore is we literally cut with shears a pie wedge into one of the nests, and took that whole section out, that pie slice out, and then looked at the stratification, the layers of material. And then we brought all that material back and air dried it. And then I had graduate students pick through it and isolate every single piece of hair that we could find. And there were some interesting samples that fell right in line with the gold standard. But anyway, this thing had an undercarriage of branches that were crisscrossed and not too complexly woven. But then on top of that was the layer of leaf litter, and then they had, and you could still see the evidence of this, because by the time I got there, when you break off the terminal meristem of a branch, then all the secondary buds then send off spriggers, and so these spriggers of 5 years of age, you could see all along where it had literally pinched off all the green tufts off of this hedgerow, and then wove it in to make a pad, and it with a raised lip, just like a big bird's nest. It's like, always made me think of that. But the thing that struck me that you drew attention to was there were probably, I can't remember the exact numbers now, there were 5 or 6, and some of them were quite large, could easily accommodate somebody like me in a fetal position.
Yeah.
But we stayed away from them when we were there even. But there was one in the center of all of these that was built in the crotch of this little shrub. And so it was only about 2.5 feet across, but it was about 2 or 3 feet off the ground. And I just, it just struck me. It looks like a bassinet.
Yeah.
It looks like, then the thought occurred to me, well, we don't find these kinds of nests very often. Is this something that we only might experience or see, or is only constructed by or on particular occasions or events that are rare events? Infrequent. There's the word I'm after. Infrequent events. Well, what might that be? Well, if these creatures, as I suspect, are large-bodied apes, and parameters of their natural history are similar to those of the other members of that superfamily, the hominoids, they give birth infrequently. Orangutans, for example, 4 to 7 years between births. So could it be that this was a gathering to coincide with the birthing of a new infant in a clan that otherwise is usually quite dispersed and doesn't stay in one spot? I mean, there's a very advantageous spot because you had the high ground. This slope ended down in a modest creek with fresh water, fish in the water. There are blueberries. That hedgerow was a productive hedge of blueberries. Anyway,
well, I find it very interesting because I talked to another researcher a while ago, and there was, and forgive me if it was covered in your book, I don't know if I necessarily saw it, but like if we're comparing them to closest ancestor being perhaps a chimpanzee, I don't know. You just said 4 to 7 years between births, but like if it's a flesh and blood real creature, a species out there, it's got to reproduce in some way. Of course. So I don't know if there's any thought about mating rituals of the Sasquatch, or sure, like where they would go to do that. Do they give birth in caves, or do they make nests, or they, they, so I mean, do they live in a family unit, or are they just kind of mate like dogs and indiscriminately? I mean, it's very like you can really get into, you can really go out.
Well, sure. And
and theorized, but like by scientifically theorized too, like if you're comparing them to other primates.
Well, exactly. And I think there's two principles to kind of adhere to. One is look, what are the clues? So, for example, almost without exception, discovery of footprints or sightings are of single individuals or what we take to be females. On rare occasion, we have females with what look like what we think are females because they have little ones. We've got little footprints in that collection 300.
Yeah.
So there are infants in tow, but it's usually solitary. So at least when they're out foraging, they're solitary. Now, and then the second principle, I mean, we're looking for clues like that and looking for repeat appearances, which might give us some idea about the extent of their home range. How far do they forage? How far do they venture out away from or across their home range? The second principle is if we're justified in placing them within this cluster, this clade, as we'd call it in taxonomy, but this of the hominoids, then and while recognizing that the living great apes don't represent the full spectrum of diversity that once was represented in the great apes, because in the fossil record, we have hundreds of species of ape that lived during the Pliocene through the Miocene, or Miocene into the Pliocene, with just a few, like our known great apes, and Gigantopithecus is the other Pleistocene ape that survived into the Pleistocene, into the Ice Age, and on, mostly in tropical refugia, like the gorilla, the chimp, the orang. If we look at so the idea being, if Sasquatch is part of that remnant of that radiation, and when we see rather consistent characteristics across the extant great apes, maybe it's fair to look for evidence or at least hypothesize aspects of the behavior in Sasquatch that are aligned with that. So like the birthing interval, for example, gestation period. The other great apes have a gestation period right about 9 months, just like us. We're not that different in those aspects. And so, maybe they only form. So well, let's compare. I mean, I think that given the fact that the amongst the three groups of great apes, chimps, well, we could add bonobos because they are distinct enough there. Chimps, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans. The orangutan is the other solitary ape. The others are much more gregarious, larger social groups, just different social structure. Gorillas have harems. Chimps have multi-male dominance. Bonobos, multi-female dominance. But if we look at the orangs, you have a male with a home range. It's not as large as I think Sasquatch are because you've got the three-dimensional aspects of the forest canopy. But in temperate forests, the resources aren't up in the canopy, and with Sasquatch, you're restricted to the ground. But it's the ground where you find the sugars, the berries, and the roots and tubers, the starches and carbohydrates, and the nuts, that do come to the ground. Mm-hmm. Pinyon pine and gamble oak and so forth, but they're harvested on the ground. Anyway, point is, orangs have this, the male doesn't dominate a harem like a gorilla does. Instead, he manages the real estate, keeps all the interlopers out, and he happens to overlap the home ranges of several females. But see, they're only interested in his company every half decade or so,
Right.
So he just gets there and yells out, broadcasts his dominance to the other bachelors. But at the same time, he's making it known that, hey, I'm the biggest, baddest guy on the block. When you ladies are so inclined, come look me up, which they do. Yeah. Which they do on rare occasions, And I wouldn't be surprised if Sasquatch, because think about it. One of the things that characterizes the orang is this raucous loud call the male uses to advertise his presence. Well, what do we have with Sasquatch? We have reports of these loud vocalizations.
Yeah. You're talking about air sacs that humans don't have or have regressed, but the giant air sacs that they use to kind of call out, and also the use of infrasound and just all these other things. Go ahead. I'm sorry. It was just
exactly. I mean, and those are important elements as well that seem to be consistent. But so you have evidence that suggests that Sasquatch are widely dispersed. They maintain that dispersal as well as attract when the opportunity is appropriate through these loud call vocalizations that are characteristic of other species that are, namely the orangutan, that potentially has a similar social structure. So to me, it's fascinating because there's all these little hints and clues that seem to align in a very logical way with what seems to be the most reasonable, hypothesis for modeling their social structure, modeling their distribution, and then from there we can branch out to address questions like population size. Because I'm constantly asked, how many Sasquatch are there? Well, we have evidence, and this has been confirmed independently by a couple of researchers using different data approaches, but have suggested that the home range is large, in part, due to repeat appearances of recognizable individual, but also patterns of reports in given geographical areas. Now, and realize we're talking in broad brushstrokes here, because in individual regions, the vagaries of topography and landforms and development and so forth are going to make this very patchy or very quite varied. But 1,000 square miles, 33 by 33 roughly.
Yeah.
About 1,000 square mile home range for a male, and incorporating a couple of females, maybe 2 or 3 females and 1 or 2 offspring, because they're going to have a long developmental period, maybe not as long as ours, because our big brain protracts that developmental trajectory by comparison to the great apes, which mature more rapidly by a few years, not by a lot, but in any case. So if you look at a map, and here's where the next thing, and this is where when I kind of made some allusions about Nebraska, if you look at a map, there have also been some interesting papers published of late, and one of them, again, we're right in the process of getting reaction to it, have recognized remarkable congruence between the distribution of black bear across North America with the report of Sasquatch. You can incorporate the vast majority of credit, especially credible. I mean, how do you assess whether something's credible? I mean, it takes a lot of work.
Right.
But you can see where the outliers are few and far between. So if you look at a distribution map of black bear across North America, that suggests habitat where a large omnivore species can survive. Now, and we could get into how you might split the omnivore niche, or what we say partition, through different adaptations, which we could talk about in a minute. But the point
go ahead. No.
Well, I was just going to say, so kind of a rule of thumb for me is, let's take that as the jumping off point. Where are there black bears still found in this continent, on this continent? And that's where you potentially could find habitat that would support a Sasquatch, that could support. So hypothetically. And then the flip side of that is, what's the density of population of the black bear? So, for example, in Idaho, there's 30 to 35,000 black bear. But you go back east, where there's also still black bear, but in a given state, there's only 2,000 to 5,000 maybe. So a different order of magnitude, which reflects the carrying capacity of the habitat. How many, what kind of population can it support? because the habitat has been fragmented. The other rule of thumb is precipitation. And John Green pointed this out 50 years ago, that Sasquatch reports and precipitation. I mean, it makes perfect sense because you need a certain level of precipitation to produce the kind of habitat where an omnivore can get sufficient resources. And so anyway, I have to pull up the map and see how Nebraska, I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, but how much habitat offers refuge for black bear, and what's the head count?
What's fascinating also is like so many of these reports and encounters are, the vast majority of them are like accidental, not intentional, not people. Yeah. So like these encounters are like serendipitous and kind of like, I'll just say it, kind of like ghost or UFO encounters. I mean, like the majority of people out there looking for these things aren't going to find them. It's just like crossing the road, or they, or you're camping and when you encounter one that way. Super fascinating. Now with all this, this grand intellect of yours and all these, decades of research and study and careful thought, do you ever, like look out in the night sky, look out across, the vast wilderness, and do you ever have like that sense of wonder of just like kind of not childlike, but like a childlike wonder of like, out there somewhere, there could be this undiscovered, wonderful species out there. And that's what I'm always filled with. I think about these things like on kind of like a kind of grand scale. Like I just think like my family went to South Dakota, and I'm kind of daydreaming, like looking at the vast Black Hills and thinking about like, what if one is out there just minding his own business, being elusive, we study some chimps. No, was it chimps? Chimpanzees, where they try and be a little elusive. They hide their footprints, sure. And are you ever left with that kind of sense of like awe and wonder when kind of removed from the scientific, in our time together?
Well, that is what enlivens science for me. It is that spirit of exploration. I mean, that's what drew me into science, was the unknown, the boundary between what we know and what we don't know. A lot of my colleagues, and this is an important role to fill, but I sometimes chide them that they submit a grant proposal for a question that they fundamentally already know the answer to.
Right.
And but it does need to be demonstrated with experimentation and replication and so forth. And so, but if that floats their boat, great.
Yeah.
But I think, well, once you've answered a question, you kind of move on to another interesting question rather than, some of my colleagues are very technique driven in their research programs. They become specialists and they use a particular instrument and to pursue a question, and they formulate questions around the application of that technique. And that's all great. But one time we were in a kind of a brainstorming session where we had sort of our department had gotten big enough. It was kind of pulling at itself. And so we had developed these working groups, and we were at one of the meetings, the person who took charge said, well, let's go around the table and you can describe the techniques you use in your laboratory. It got to me and I said, my laboratory is not technique driven. It's question driven. Here's the kind of questions I'm interested in. Right. And to get at those questions, if there's a particular technique that I can't master or haven't the wherewithal to carry out, I collaborate with someone who has that. So, there's a role for both, but I think one sometimes can be more dynamic than the other, and it's a personal persuasion. But anyway,
well,
so I fully appreciate what you're saying, because I do that all the time. I mean, the prospect when I spend a lot of time out in the field. Recently health issues have kind of maybe put the kibosh on some of that, but given the luxury of a 9-month contract, I would have the ability to go into the field for long periods of stretches of time. And so I've, spent months at a time in the field, and it's that wonder that keeps you going. what's behind the next ridge, or what's around the tree over there? What was that sound I just heard?
I love that. I love that because and you've been so great, and I appreciate all this time that you've given me and my listeners. But I just like when I think about ghosts, and I think like, what happens after our bodily death? It's an age-old question.
Sure.
When I look up at the night sky and I think about UFOs, and I'm like, are we truly alone in the universe? And when I think about like cryptozoology, and I think about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and I look at the vastness of nature, and I love thinking about just out there in nature, there's this beautiful creature out there that's living away from human beings. Once in a while we might encounter it, but it's just that mystery of life. And I just absolutely, it just fills me with wonder, and I think it keeps me mentally invigorated, like challenging these questions and everything like that. So, but I got to tell you, like having you on my program, what an absolute joy and a treat. And I'd love to have you on again to talk about more about these mysteries and everything. But Dr. Jeff Meldrum, it's been just an absolute pleasure. Like I showed you a copy of your book that I thoroughly enjoyed. This is the first Sasquatch book that I read in third grade. It was published in the 70s, and it was in my school library. I found it on eBay and I had to rebuy it, but it's called Bigfoot All Over the Country. But I just remember, I just remember in third grade, like watching the Patterson-Gimlin film with my dad, and like checking out this book from the library and watching In Search Of, and just being part of the mystery, and just exploring it. And I can't thank you enough for helping me, just kind of, question what's out there and explore the mysteries out there.
Absolutely. Well, my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. And sure, let's do it again.
Absolutely. Well, there we go, everybody. Episode 272. The Necronomicast, featuring Dr. Jeff Meldrum and his book and his work, Legend Meets Science. You want to read a book? You want to read a scientific textbook about Sasquatch? You think this is all a bunch of BS, a bunch of bean soup? Grab that book and give that a read. It'll make you think in ways about Sasquatch that I've never thought about it, him, they, there before. Incredible guest, incredible mind. And to have like Dr. Jeff Meldrum, to have Bob Gimlin, to have Ron Moorhead, to have like Ken Gerhard, and I almost said who I've got coming up in a couple weeks. I almost said it. I don't want to give it away yet. But I'll tell you who's on the next episode. Oh my gosh, I've got all these great episodes coming up. There's a great new book coming out called Women on the Fringe, a study of the women of the paranormal. The authors of that, all three of them, I don't have their names in front of me, sorry, but they're going to be on the show. Katie Page from Beyond Skinwalker Ranch, my friends from the Quite Unusual podcast will be joining me. A cavalcade of stars, all for you, ladies and gentlemen. Getting ready to host Sasquatch Sunset with my friend Steve Berg. I caught an advanced screening of it, and oh my god, yeah, go see it. Go see it. If you like anything Sasquatch, just go see it. And until then, friends, take care. Have a great night, a great life. Now go get some sleep.